And then we'll be on Cathy, and Danielle will continue with her introduction, and we'll go from there.
You can hear me?
Yeah, I'm hearing buzzing.
Good morning and welcome to our webinar, introducing the report Smoke and Mirrors. Healthcare company retirement plans are addicted to tobacco. According to the World Health Organization, tobacco remains a devastating yet preventable public health crisis, causing more than 8 million deaths a year. Despite perceptions that the smoking problem is well in hand, smoking remains a daunting public health challenge today. In particular, tobacco and nicotine products have an outsized negative impact on youth. As you will hear, almost 20% of kids get hooked by seeing tobacco imagery in movies. According to the US Surgeon General, ending smoking imagery in movies would significantly reduce the number of teen smokers and prevent up to 1 million deaths per year. I mean, most of us don't realize that many of the mutual funds and exchange traded funds we invest in, including those in our retirement plans, can be heavily invested in the promotion, marketing, and production of tobacco products around the world. As You Sow is proud to present this webinar to help you learn more about the options available to withhold such indirect support of tobacco products. We are proud to introduce a group of panelists who specialize in tobacco-free funds and have a history of engaging in anti-tobacco promotion, investing, and marketing. First, just some general information. If you have questions as you go along, please type them into the chat window. You can see here what it looks like. And after the webinar, you will receive an email link to the recording. We also will have our panelists, they've volunteered to answer any questions we didn't get to. So let's meet the panelists. Today we have Dr. Phillip Gardner, co-chair of the I won't read all of their bios because they'll be available to you. We have Jono Polansky from UCSF, David Shugar, who's our report author, Cathy, Rowan, Director of Socially Responsible Investments of Trinity Health, Dr. Bronwyn, CEO of TobaccoFree Portfolios, and myself, Danielle Fougier, President of As You Sow. And I see, Dr. Gardner, you're the only person I didn't read, so you are the co-chair of the African American Tobacco Control Leadership Council. Next slide. So I'd like to introduce first Dr. Phillip Gardner. Take it away, Dr. Gardner.
Well, look, thank you for having me. I'm going to make this short. I guess the thesis of what I'm going to present to you, maintaining tobacco stocks just perpetuates decades of predatory marketing by the tobacco industry and the Black community. The investment will help in this fight. I'm going to give you some background on that. Let's go to the next slide. As was mentioned, I'm the co-chair of the African American Tobacco Control Leadership Council. We've actually been leading the fight around menthol, getting it banned here in the United States. And I just recently retired from the University of California Office of the President Tobacco-Related Disease Research Program. Next slide. If you take anything away from the presentation today, I would hope that you would take this away. You can see that starting in 1953, only 5% of African Americans used menthol cigarettes. By 1968, it had almost tripled to 14%. By 1976, it had tripled again to 44%. And by the mid-2000s, it had doubled into 82%. Today, some 85% of African American adults and 93% of African American youth use menthol cigarettes. Next slide. There's some reasons for that. I'm going to spend a little time here. 91% of advertising budget in the late 1950s and early 60s by Brown and Williams got the message across that Black folks were looking at TV ads and it registered with them more than their white components. That's why 91% of the advertising budget was put in TV commercials. Tobacco companies began to use more male actors with more Black features. Tripled the cigarette advertising in ebony. took on the black folks medium or idiom, and using menthol's got a brand new bag. The Cool Jazz Festival came out of this, the Cool Lexicon, and unfortunately, many groups within the black community take money from the tobacco industry. Next slide. This is a slide from 1963 where Elston Howard, captured for the New York Yankees, is selling you cool cigarettes. You have to remember in 1963, there's the bombings in Birmingham, there's the March on Washington. The United States is thoroughly segregated, but the tobacco industry is ahead of this game. Next slide. By the late 60s, early 70s, they've taken on the whole appearance, African Americans in dashikis, beads, and afros. Next slide. By the mid 70s, knowing that black folks like basketball, whether they're dressed for it or not, notice it's alive with Newport pleasure. Notice all the groups are getting into this. Next slide. By the 90s and moving into the 2000s, it's fired up. Again, the idiom is taking over. We're talking about Newport pleasure. Next slide. This is a file that was taken from the tobacco industry by LaTanisha Wright, who worked there. The tobacco industry has been disproportionately dealing with this for some time. They came up with the terms focus communities and non-focus communities. Of course, focus communities, their focus are inner city, colored, poor, and in my case, black. Of course, non-focus communities are upscale, suburban, rural, and white. Next slide. This is the second slide I want you to keep your attention on. When we talk about predatory marketing, the tobacco industry is extremely clear on what they're doing. What you see before you here is a dose-response relationship. As the percent of African American students increased, the proportion of menthol ads increased. This was done in California by Dr. Lisa Hendrickson at Stanford. But as the enrollment increased, the amount of signage for menthol cigarettes increased. Tobacco industry knew this stuff all along. Next slide. Menthol cigarettes are cheaper for African Americans. We found out in that last study that Newports were 12 cents lower. And of course, Newport promotions were 42% higher than compared to other areas in California. Next slide. If that was California, then this is Massachusetts, comparing Brookline, an upscale white community, with Dorchester, a poor colored community, initially predominantly black. You can see the p-values or the significance. There are many more retail ads in Dorchester. The ads are significantly larger in Dorchester. The menthol ads are off the chart more in Dorchester. And I guess what pisses me off the most is the average price of menthol cigarettes in Dorchester are nearly 50 cents cheaper. Next slide. What has been the outcome of all of this? And this is why the divesting of tobacco stocks would help this situation. These are lung cancer incidence rates by race and ethnicity. The top red line, of course, are African American males are dying disproportionately of lung cancer. This incidence, we'll get to the death rate shortly. Next slide. Even though African American women have a lower incidence in this category, but if we were to put diabetes or breast cancer up there, which are also related to smoking, you'd see that they'd have higher incidence rates too. Next slide. These are the death rates. Again, the top red line, African American men dying disproportionately. Many colleagues would say, oh, the gap is shortening or getting smaller. I would suggest to you that there is a gap, and there's a reason for that gap, and that's what I showed you in the few slides previously. Next slide. Again, African American women don't have the same rates of death from lung cancer, but if we look at the next slide, you can see that, no, Gonna need to back up one, please. You can see that, of course, Black men die disproportionately from myocardial and fatal coronary heart disease than other people. What's interesting in this slide is that Black women have greater incidence of fatal coronary heart disease than even white men. Next slide. Again, cerebrovascular disparities, stroke, again, African Americans at the top. Unfortunately, Black females are second only to them. I'm going to suggest to you that these disparities come from somewhere. Next slide. I think what I'm trying to take, or what the take-home message is menthol is a social justice issue. The disproportionate marketing and targeting of candy-flavored poison to African Americans and other especially oppressed sectors of our society is outright discriminatory and genocidal. We're talking about the folks who are the poorest, people who are the least informed, folks with the fewest resources. Indeed, it's the definition of preying on the most vulnerable sections of our society. Next slide. If menthol were banned, hundreds of lives would be saved. This chart that I'm drawing this from goes up to 100%, but if just 30% of the people who were smoking menthol cigarettes didn't have access to them and would quit, over 500,000 lives would be saved. Over 250,000 of those Black menthol smokers would be saved. Next slide. So what's at stake? Next slide. This is what's at stake. It's our future, it's our children. Here's a young man, hat backward, baggy pants, skateboard, surrounded by tobacco imagery in his neighborhood. Let me just return to how I started this, that maintaining tobacco stocks just perpetuates decades of predatory marketing by the tobacco industry. By divesting, you can be part of this fight. With that, I want to thank you. And I can take questions either in the box or we can deal with it later. Last slide. Thank you.
And thank you, Dr. Phillip Gardner. I think that was another astounding revelation as to the wide range of issues that people of color are dealing with on a daily basis. So thank you for that. And now,
you're muted.
and next slide, please. I'd like to introduce Jono Polansky to talk to us about smoke-free movies.
Thank you. Next slide. Well, we all know who the tobacco makers are. Actually, in the past few years, there have been fewer of them and they've been bigger. There are about 6 companies globally who now dominate the tobacco market. But who are the tobacco promoters? Who are actually recruiting new smokers as adult smokers are killed by tobacco? Who's replacing one market with another? Well, why are these companies on the list that healthcare and other investors should screen out? Well, there's a pile of documentary and scientific evidence showing that smoking on screen is the last unrestricted media channel promoting tobacco addiction to kids. And we have the data to hold individual media companies accountable. I have about 8 minutes to cover a lot of history and a lot of harm, and one of the biggest public health opportunities of our time. So let's get going. Next slide, please. First, the historical evidence, much of it from the tobacco industry's own files. Among the 14 million tobacco industry documents digitized at the University of California, San Francisco, with whom I work, memos, agreements, and other documents trace at least 8 decades of covert collaboration between Hollywood companies and big tobacco companies. Advance the slide, please. This timeline shows the different ways that tobacco companies have used entertainment media to sell smoking in each era. Now, the story behind that Barbara Stanwyck ad that we just saw and scores like it, because of Hollywood's own rule at the time against product placement in the 30s and 40s, movie stars smoked generic cigarettes on screen where you couldn't see a brand. but then they showed up in print ads and radio ads for specific brands for a fee, and the ads plugged the stars, the studios, and their latest movies along with the tobacco brand. The tobacco companies, in effect, paid for practically all of the studio's national advertising, worth millions of dollars. By the end of the studio era that you've all heard of, that glamorous time, 75% of the biggest box office stars in the United States were on tobacco company payrolls. The payoffs weren't public, of course. As media change, as we see on this timeline, the promotional schemes change. For example, after 1970, when tobacco commercials were kicked off of radio and TV, the tobacco companies went back to Hollywood and touched at least 600 mainstream movies with brand and unbranded product placement of tobacco. And that continued into at least the 90s. And the last thing that got caught out was in the mid-2010s, around 2013 in France. New slide, please. But even as those techniques change, some things in Hollywood don't change. Many of the same studios with movies and TV shows that are named in tobacco company files are still in business, sometimes with new owners, but with libraries full of old films and shows now being monetized on a streaming channel near you. That is, the investment in smoking as far back as the 30s or 40s is still paying off today on various streaming channels. And of course, these companies are also making new films and shows with smoking of all ratings. In the past 5 years, tobacco incidents and exposures from top grossing movies made in Hollywood have doubled. Next slide, please. This table, too much to take in at one glance, certainly, but if you want to use it as a reference later, please do. This table breaks down the modern company's shares of the tobacco risked audiences. That is, how much risk are they delivering? How much exposure are they delivering? It's based on our unique database of tobacco content in all the top grossing films released in the last 18 years, all 3,000 of those films. Three things stick out. First, all the companies, these big names on the left, are roughly equal in the tobacco exposure they deliver to moviegoers. Second, in total, more than half of all their movies of all ratings show smoking in the last generation. 56% of movies, more than 50,000 tobacco incidents in their films. And these movies together have delivered 373 billion, with a B, tobacco exposures to domestic audiences alone, that is the US and Canada moviegoers. Now, about 80% of all exposures from US films, though, are delivered to populations outside the US, triggering new laws and regulations worldwide, and also raising, in many cases, the same sort of justice issues as Dr. Gardner has pointed out domestically, in that they're targeting the same lower income markets overseas as they target in the United States. So thanks to Breathe California, Sacramento region for the data that helps us make these observations. Next slide, please. Now, even the fresh-faced new Hollywood players like Netflix have fallen right into the old tobacco promotion rut. Remember how that previous slide showed that 56% of top grossing movies of all ratings have shown smoking since 2002? Well, since 2012, 55%, almost exactly the same proportion of all Netflix scripted original shows have featured smoking, including more than 60% of their TV 14 rated shows produced in English, rated for adolescents. New slide, please. Here's an example from one of Netflix's most watched shows, Stranger Things season 3 last year, rated TV 14, equivalent to PG-13 in movies. See a Camel Brands on the left, alongside Coca-Cola. You see Marlboro front and center at a convenience store with somebody making a purchase. That power wall appears several times in that season. And then on the right, you see a pack of Marlboros right up against some Burger King French fries and right next to a Slurpee. Now, the Coca-Cola and Burger King had explicit promotional tie-ins with the show, and the brand Marlboro just shows up, and I think we're supposed to believe that it's getting a free ride. Perhaps. Next slide, please. So that's the history of the tobacco industry using mass entertainment deliberately and spending millions on it to recruit kids. Now, we also have conclusive scientific evidence, so we don't have to take the tobacco company's word for it that smoking on screen sells smoking. There have been more than a decade of studies tracking 50,000 children and teens in more than a dozen countries in North America, Latin America, Europe, and Asia. They've all reached the same conclusion, which is very important in research, that you get consistent results. And based on that research, the US Surgeon General concluded in 2012, the evidence is sufficient to conclude that there is a causal relationship between depictions of smoking in the movies and the initiation of smoking among young people. Now that may seem kind of dry, bureaucratic language, but in the public health field, that's extremely powerful language. They've never had to withdraw such a statement that the Surgeon General has made finding a causal relationship. And it was actually the Surgeon General's finding in 1964 that smoking causes lung cancer that started the moves to restrict tobacco marketing, including marketing to kids. The proven fact is the more smoking the more smoking that kids see on screen, the more likely they are to smoke and vape. So how much harm are we talking about? Next slide, please. In cold numbers, on-screen smoking recruits 37% of all new young tobacco users in the US. The US CDC projected 5 years ago that exposure to smoking on screen will add 6.4 million new young smokers in this generation of kids in the US alone, of whom 2 million will die from tobacco-caused diseases, including heart disease, strokes, lung cancer, and a dozen varieties of, lung disease and a dozen varieties of cancer. Now, the economic cost kind of pales before the human cost, but there are estimates that this added death and disease will cost the country $118 billion. Since the entertainment industry was first briefed on this evidence a generation ago, you might say that their delay in correcting the problem has cost us, over $118 billion so far. And by the way, for the investors in the audience, $118 billion is more than 60 times Netflix's net income in 2019, just to take one company example. Next slide, please. Now, in addition to potential brand risk, reputational risk, potential legal liability, obviously, there are also marketing and regulatory risks to entertainment companies that push tobacco at kids. The framework is already in place internationally. WHO's Global Tobacco Control Treaty has 181 parties. In self-defense, more countries are enacting regulations around tobacco promotion on screen. So tobacco, which used to be a source of payoffs, is not paying off as well anymore. In fact, it's become another source of risk for an entertainment industry already in great upheaval. Even France has warned its film industry to, quote, stop advertising cigarettes, unquote. China, India, and Nigeria already have their first sets of rules in place, such as on-screen warnings, covering nearly 40% of the world's population outside the US. So why aren't media companies who depend on these international markets for actually being profitable, why aren't they future-proofing their films and TV shows by keeping them smoke-free? That's a very good question to ask. Next slide. As an illustration of the international mood, on-screen smoking was the focus of WHO's World No Tobacco Day this year. WHO, health ministries worldwide, and NGOs worldwide distributed this poster and others like it in many languages. I think it sums up the issue pretty well. Next slide, please. Now, you can ask then, what do we want the entertainment companies to do? That's been talked about a lot, and that set of solutions, was arrived at actually quite a while ago, and it's been presented consistently to the Motion Picture Association and to the other companies by a bunch of people. And what we want them to do, theatrical and streaming differ a bit, but these are the evidence-based forward-looking solutions media companies have been slow walking for the past decade or more. The details of these are online at Smokefree Movies, UCSF. First is to rate future films and TV shows with smoking R or TVMA, which would discourage putting tobacco in the shows in the first place because they have smaller audiences if they have higher ratings. At least that's been true in the past. Right now, the rating systems don't treat tobacco as a rating factor at all, even though it's the only content proven to cause widespread physical harm to young audiences. If you add anti-tobacco spots and plain language advance warnings, then parents are equipped to do something about it. A warning would be something like smoking on screen harms young viewers. No movie or TV company has ever made that statement. Number 3, companies should stipulate that producers of a film or show with smoking must certify there were no tobacco payoffs. The actual language to work must be quite inclusive, obviously. Number 4, end tobacco brand display on screen in future titles. It looks like product placement and in fact has been product placement. And finally, the generous tax credits and other taxpayer giveaways for tobacco promoting films and TV shows. Over $2.2 billion paid out over the last decade to Hollywood producers of movies with smoking need to be fixed. Some states right now are spending more to promote tobacco on screen than they do to prevent kids from smoking and vaping. Meanwhile, if you don't have tobacco imagery in your film or show, none of this will affect you at all. Nobody's calling for a ban on all tobacco, just responsible treatment of the leading cause of premature preventable death, 8 million deaths a year and growing. If it's the #1 cause of preventable death, we need to actually prevent it. I'll hand that back and maybe meet you again for a wrap up at the end of the show. Thank you for your time. I'm handing it back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Jono. I think we will all see films and TV shows in a new light now. And now I'll hand off to David Shugar, who's going to go through some of the findings of the report for you.
Great. Thank you for the introduction. Next slide, please. The purpose of the Smoke and Mirrors report is to assess just how prevalent tobacco-related investments are in common retirement funds and healthcare company plans. Our results confirm that tobacco investments are widespread, and 75% of the most common retirement funds invest in either tobacco producers or tobacco promoting media companies. Another key finding is that on average, tobacco-free funds tend to outperform funds with tobacco investments, which demonstrate that social responsibility and competitive returns can be achieved simultaneously. Finally, we did a deep dive into the healthcare sector to assess their tobacco exposure, and astonishingly, 100% of the companies we rated have holdings in both tobacco producers and promoters. Next slide. Going into more details of our findings, we assessed the 100 most popular mutual funds used in retirement plans. And we found that 55% of these funds invest in tobacco producers, such as Phillip Morris, Altria, and British American Tobacco. These funds received an F grade for their tobacco exposure. 20% of these popular funds did not invest in tobacco producers, but they invested in tobacco promoters, such as AT&T, Comcast, Disney, and Viacom CBS. These companies have failed to mandate our ratings for tobacco imagery and have not taken a stand against big tobacco. These funds received a B grade for their tobacco exposure. This means that out of the 100 most common mutual funds used in retirement accounts, only 25% are tobacco-free and received an A grade, while 75% or 3/4 still invest in tobacco producers and promoters. This results confirm that tobacco is not an issue of the past, but is widespread in current retirement funds. Next slide. Another important finding of the report was that tobacco-free funds tend to outperform funds with tobacco investments. This result remained true across different time periods, such as 3-year, 5-year, and 10-year trailing returns. For example, tobacco-free funds had 10-year trailing returns of 15.5%, while funds invested in tobacco had a return of 12.1%. While a difference of 3.4% may not seem much, this difference compounds over time. To illustrate this, $1,000 invested in tobacco-free funds with A grades would have grown to $4,200 in 10 years, while those invested in tobacco would have only grown to $3,100. These results confirm the fact that socially responsible investing and competitive returns are not mutually exclusive. and it's possible to make the world a better place and to make money at the same time. Next slide. Another important result of the report was that tobacco investments are very common in healthcare company retirement plans, even though these companies have a mission to make the world a more healthy place. All of the healthcare companies that we rated, including Abbott Laboratories, CVS Health, Johnson & Johnson, and Pfizer, had investments in tobacco producers and tobacco promoters, thereby receiving an F grade. Another noteworthy item to mention was the general lack of transparency in many retirement plans. Some financial vehicles, such as common collective trusts and separately managed accounts, do not have mandatory requirements to report their holdings, which make finding the underlying investments extremely difficult or impossible. For example, the company Community Health Systems did not disclose any of their assets. The amount of assets that could be rated are listed on the table in this slide. This lack of transparency means that there may be more tobacco investments hidden in these retirement plans that are not publicly disclosed. To address this issue, companies should become more transparent about their holdings and let their participants easily find what's in their retirement plan and to choose options which align with their values. Next slide, please. Now I'll give a short demonstration of TobaccoFree Funds, which is a free tool that can help you identify funds that are tobacco-free. So this is the TobaccoFree Funds website, and it could be found at tobaccofreefunds.org. To start, I will look up a fund that's very common and that's in CVS Health Retirement Plan, which is the Vanguard S&P 500 Index. When you select the fund, you can see what is inside. And this fund receives an F grade because 3% of the total holdings are in tobacco producers and promoters. If we scroll down, we can see some of the holdings that have been flagged. This fund, for example, has 2 tobacco holdings and 4 tobacco promoter holdings. As I scroll down, there's more information about the issue, and you can see the specific holdings that are in this fund. For example, this fund has Phillip Morris and Altria as tobacco companies, Walt Disney, AT&T, and others as promoters. As I continue to scroll down, there's also a more general sustainability scorecard for the fund, which includes issues such as fossil fuels, deforestation, gender equality, firearms, and more. This helps give a more comprehensive view of the fund's performance across a number of issues. Finally, there's financial performance data that can help assess the fund, and this is given over multiple time periods, which can be looked at in comparison to various benchmarks. Now, going back to the homepage, I want to highlight another important tool, which is the top scoring funds. This table is sorted by tobacco grade, and so these are some funds that have an A grade in tobacco and are tobacco free. So this can be used to help find funds that are the highest performing and have good returns. For example, Parnassus and Calvert are some of the managers here that have some of the highest rating funds. I also want to note that TobaccoFree Funds is part of the larger investor values platform, where you can go to fossil-free funds, deforestation-free funds, and the other websites to get comprehensive sustainability scores on a range of issues for mutual funds. So make sure to check out investor values and TobaccoFree Funds to find funds that align with your values. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Great question. Are your savings going up in smoke? It's great to hear that once again, paying attention to social issues can pay off in fund returns. So thank you for that. We'll now turn to Cathy Rowan to talk about responsible investments. Thanks.
Thanks, Danielle. And I think you'll hear some echoes from John's presentation in the next few minutes, Jono's presentation in the next few minutes, because I think the data that he presented has really compelled investors to engage companies, the movie studio companies, to become smoke-free. Next slide, please. So I'm part of a small but growing group of members of the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility, which is a national coalition of faith-based institutional investors and other socially responsible investors who have been taking part in shareholder dialogues with executives from the parent companies of movie studios since 2003. And why are we engaging with these companies? I think Jono spoke very well of this in terms of the long history of the relationship between tobacco companies and the movie studios and the impact that that relationship has had on public health, as well as the science. To repeat Surgeon General's significant finding, the evidence is sufficient to conclude that there is a causal relationship between depictions of smoking in the movies and the initiation of smoking among young people. We investors see this as being about the distribution and marketing of an unsafe product. Shareholders for many years have engaged a variety of companies on the issue of product safety. And here we have a product, tobacco, that's depicted in movies that causes harm and youth are exposed to it. We feel this is a huge risk that parent companies of movie studios must address and mitigate and remedy, because causing less harm is the right thing for companies to do. So we began these conversations based on ICCR's credibility as an investor engagement organization with these companies, 2003. And the company's initial responses to our conversations, our questions, was that this issue of tobacco in movies was something they really didn't have control over. I remember in one of the early dialogues with the company, they told us, we aren't the captains of the ship. You really should be talking to the directors and the writers and the actors. We didn't take that as the final word, as the evidence continued to mount that tobacco in movies is a key recruiter of young people to begin smoking. So we've used the tools in our shareholder engagement toolkit that you see laid out there in terms of the different actions shareholders can take, even though the most powerful leverage that shareholders can have, the shareholder proposal, was not available to us due to rulings at the Securities and Exchange Commission. So we've used investor letters, our longstanding history and reputation with ICCR and as long-term investors, and dialogues to call on the companies to adopt policies to prohibit tobacco depictions in movies for youth. And Time Warner was the first company to develop a policy in 2005. And by 2013, all the major studios had similar policies, I think due in part to our persistent engagements. Disney's so far is the most comprehensive policy. In 2015, they pledged that no cigarettes would appear in Disney youth-rated films, and neither would they appear in their other branded studios like Lucasfilms, Marvel, and Pixar. Investor pressure led to Disney announcing at their 2020 annual shareholder meeting that this policy would extend to its new Fox division of films, but we haven't seen that in writing yet. And this shareholder pressure over time has caused the companies to at least acknowledge the responsibility that they have. Next slide, please. So we continue to meet with the companies to monitor implementation of their policies. And unfortunately, as you see here, implementation has been uneven. Some years a particular company will keep tobacco out of all of its youth films, and then other years it's a huge problem. And that's because there are loopholes in these policies. Such language in the policies include, quote, "We endeavor to reduce or eliminate depictions of smoking unless there is a creative reason for such depictions." Or, quote, "We are working on eliminating tobacco where appropriate and feasible." In regards to distributing films that are produced by third parties, some companies will say that they discourage depictions in those cases. I think this is a remnant of their argument that they are not captains of the ship. So the unevenness of this implementation is disturbing, and so therefore calls for shareholders to do more. It's been over 15 years of engagement, and their response to the issue has been a slow and grinding one. Companies tell us about the resources, the internal resources that they put into policy implementation. Some of them are very aware of the metrics found on the Smoke-Free Movies campaign in regards to counting tobacco depictions per film. So it's frustrating to us that progress so far has been only halfway. Next slide, please. And now with the increasing number of viewers of streaming content and the popularity among young people of streaming shows that contain tobacco, these companies that have made some progress in theatrical films are having us almost start over again with their streaming divisions. And in addition, we need to educate the pure streaming companies like Netflix and their executives about the risks that audiences face. This summer, 35 institutional investors representing over $67 billion in assets under management wrote to 8 media companies that have streaming services. And one of the things we pointed out in the letter, in the context of the reputation risk that companies face, is the theme of the World Health Organization's No Tobacco Day that Jono spoke of. One aspect of that theme, or actually the main aspect of that theme, is protecting youth from industry manipulation and preventing them from tobacco and nicotine use. And the WHO names as an example of industry manipulation, quote, "indirect marketing of tobacco products in movies, TV shows, and online streaming shows." And it calls on film, TV, or drama production companies to join the fight against the tobacco epidemic by pledging not to depict tobacco or e-cigarette use. So we're in the process of meeting with companies to discuss our letter and their response to our requests based on the evidence-based actions that Jono spoke of in his presentation and that are contained in the What is Hollywood Hiding report. Next slide, please. We have a new tool in our shareholder engagement toolbox that helps lay out the business case. This package discusses the existing restrictions in the US on marketing tobacco to kids, provides the statements of the Surgeon General and the Centers for Disease Control, talks about letters that over 40 state attorneys general have written to the media companies calling on them to take specific actions. The International Tobacco Treaty, which includes a binding pledge from governments worldwide to end tobacco promotion in film and TV and entertainment media. And the latter, we believe, is really critical for companies, given the fact they rely so much on the international market. So in the age of COVID-19, eliminating tobacco from youth-rated films and shows can't take another 15 to 20 years. There are hundreds of millions of lives at stake worldwide because of media companies promoting tobacco like it was 1960. And so for all investors participating in the webinar, really ask you to consider these issues in your investment decisions. Thanks. Back to you, Danielle.
Thank you, Cathy. Thank you for your hard work in this arena. I know it hasn't been easy to keep the industry's attention focused on this important issue. So now we'll turn to Dr. Bronwyn King.
Thank you, Danielle, and hello to everybody. I'm joining you at 5:30 in the morning from Melbourne, Australia, so it's very nice to see so many people online. If we could just move to the first slide, please. Straight to the next one is a slide that, straight to the next slide, please. Yep, there we go, is a slide that shows the scale of the problem of tobacco, which really is just an extraordinarily big problem. If we have a look, this slide is to show that there's only 7.5 billion people in the world, and the World Health Organization has predicted that this century 1 billion people will die as a result of tobacco. So it's really a problem of catastrophic proportions. And if we look at the time of COVID, how Cathy was mentioning, you know, we're living through this extraordinary pandemic, and so far this year globally, the death toll from COVID is absolutely terrible. It's over 1 million people, but the death toll from tobacco is approximately 6 times that death toll so far this year. So tobacco really is worth some time in your agenda because it really is just such an enormous problem. Could you just move on to the next slide, please? And so many people will say that sustainability is becoming increasingly sophisticated and complex when it comes to sustainable finance. And here are some logos that represent just some of the really important issues that are on the sustainability agenda. And in fact, I made this slide some years ago, and I just keep adding and adding and adding because more and more issues come up, and all of them are very important issues that need to be dealt with by investors. And really, it's a process of acknowledging that these issues are important and working out what is the best way to deal with each issue. So for some, it will be taking a very strong approach. For others, it may be you know, employing a different tool. And if we just move to the next slide, there are some well-known tools in the investment world. These are sort of the 6 well-known tools that big investors can leverage to try to create change regarding each one of those sustainability issues. Now, the one that people jump on most of all is engagement. And I think, like Cathy has explained, engaging with some companies can be extremely productive, particularly in the climate space. This is being used very broadly to great effect. Oh, can I just say, I can hear someone still on the line. I just wonder if someone could maybe just mute. Maybe Danielle, I'm not sure if someone, I can just hear some interference. Anyway, moving on, I think it's just important to link the issue with the most appropriate tool to create change regarding that specific issue. So engagement is very helpful for many companies, but not for tobacco. And the reason why engagement makes no sense for tobacco companies is that it's a really binary proposition. If you invest in a company, you want that company to grow and succeed and thrive. And really, I'm yet to meet anyone in the finance sector who wants that of tobacco companies. Engagement needs to be for something really measurable and something impactful. And really the only engagement with tobacco companies that is wanted is one where you sit down with the tobacco company and ask them to cease their core business. It's really a very binary proposition. And as a result of that, the World Health Organization and the United Nations has an absolute non-engagement policy with the tobacco industry. And it's based on the fundamental and irreconcilable conflict of interest between the tobacco industry and the human right to life, and the tobacco industry and the human right to health. So in this particular case, engagement is futile. Best of sector doesn't make any sense for tobacco companies. There are no best tobacco companies. They all make products that kill people. ESG integration is really a financial tool, but doesn't actually look at exclusion. And impact investing and thematic investing are very good on the positive side, but they don't deal with the fact that you own the stock. And then we land on exclusion policy. And it's certainly not something that you jump to quickly. It's something that is available for investors when no other tools are effective. And if you just move on to the next slide, please. It's helpful to have just have a little framework for how you might justify taking such a strong position in your portfolio. First of all, ask a question of the company. Does this company make a product that can be used safely? And the answer for tobacco companies is no. There is no safe use of tobacco in any form. The second question, which has already been alluded to, is around whether a global treaty exists to deal with the problem that this company causes or these company cause. So there's only one global health treaty that exists, and it is the UN Tobacco Control Treaty. It's got a very complicated name, the World Health Organization Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. But despite that big mouthful, it's been signed and ratified by 181 countries to really recognise that this problem is so big that we all need to stand shoulder to shoulder to deal with it. And then the third question is, well, which one of those tools really applies for this specific issue? And as I've gone through, there really tobacco is binary. You're either in or you're out. It's as simple as that. And so just moving on to the next slide, please. Many in the finance sector, of course, are focused on the financial risks associated with investing in tobacco. And I've only got a moment here to speak through them, but here are just some of the risks that the tobacco industry faces. Regulatory risk, with 181 countries committed to implementing tougher and tougher regulation. That really reduces the appeal of smoking, increases protection of our children, and reduces demand for the product. The litigation risk has been present for many years, but it is intensifying, and it's the business model that's being called out. A business model where all of the costs are externalised to the community, yet all of the profits are returned just to the individual private companies. People are challenging this as a concept, and we've seen some very interesting legal cases in recent years, particularly in Canada, where the tobacco industry lost a case where the people of Quebec province sued the tobacco industry to recoup the costs that were inflicted on the government, on the people, as a result of tobacco. And that has spurred other legal cases popping up in other countries. The supply chain risk is significant. Human Rights Watch International regularly reports on the amount of children who are involved in child labour to produce tobacco. And in fact, the US Department of Labor has a list on its website of 16 countries that use children in tobacco growing. And really, scrutiny of supply chains is only intensifying, and that's a business model that the tobacco industry simply cannot continue to rely upon. The environmental risks are getting a lot of airtime at the moment as everybody turns their attention to climate change. And in fact, many people are really shocked to learn that the #1 ocean plastic is cigarette filters. So many people think it's plastic bottles or straws. It's not. Cigarette filters, the #1 ocean plastic. There's also 5% of deforestation that occurs globally as a result of tobacco production. So there's some very significant environmental negatives associated with tobacco. And then, of course, there's a reputation risk of being associated with companies that make products that kill 8 million people every year. It's simply time to separate a company's reputation and activity from tobacco companies. If you just move to the next slide, these financial risks have all converged at the same time, and we've seen a very dramatic impact on tobacco company share price in recent years. And so there was a peak in early 2017, but since then, tobacco companies have been under a lot of pressure financially, and that has been, and we've seen this sort of really dramatic decline in share price, putting them under a lot of pressure. If you go to the next slide, you'll see that in fact in 2018, tobacco companies were the worst performing sector on the market. And we have worked with many big financial institutions that have got out of tobacco and have done much better as a result of that. So I know David has said that this report has shown that TobaccoFree Funds reform. And that certainly has been our experience as well. The biggest pension plan in Europe, ABP, they got rid of all of their tobacco in 2017. By the end of the year, they were €700 million better off. So aside for all the other reasons why you might consider going tobacco free, making money, having robust financial returns, and certainly not being exposed to the significant financial risks of tobacco is a very good reason. If you move on to the next slide, we have a picture from the launch of the Tobacco-Free Finance Pledge. This is a good-spirited pledge that aims to bring together investors all over the world that truly are committed to sustainable finance and to making the world a better place through their investments. We had the support of President Macron and the Australian Prime Minister and some really big corporates, and we were very pleased to launch this on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly 2 years ago. You'll see there in the front row, or in the second row rather, is Dr. Tedros Ghebreyesus, the head of the World Health Organization, who spoke at our event, and we certainly thank him for his support of this initiative. And he describes tobacco-free finance as the missing piece of global tobacco control. And I think it's worth just going to the very last slide to talk about how Big Tobacco has pushed back against this initiative and against this work. In a whole range of ways, we've seen Big Tobacco really try to adopt the sustainability agenda. And I would certainly argue that Big Tobacco and the word sustainable do not belong in the same sentence. We have seen Big Tobacco join sustainability groups all across the world. We have seen them hire very influential sustainability experts who have used their position and their influence to try to promote tobacco companies. So I would ask everybody who is in sustainable finance to do some Google searches on sustainability experts that you are engaging with to find out if in fact they are promoting tobacco. We found tobacco companies, especially in the past few years, have really upped their sponsorship of very prominent media agencies to try to get their message out and to try to improve their really rapidly eroding social license. Tobacco companies turn up to notable world events to which they are not invited. So the UN has a specific no tobacco policy, and so does the World Economic Forum. But unfortunately, tobacco companies still show up at various events. And also they continue to create confusion. So that, if you have a look at that slide there on the right-hand side at the bottom, that slide is, that was the flagship picture of the new Tobacco Portfolios website, which we launched in June. And 1 month later, a big tobacco company launched an initiative, and they used exactly the same picture that we had used from our website. So, you know, trying to create confusion that we're somehow associated. So I think I will leave it there, other than to say we really warmly welcome discussions with investors, especially in the USA, and we certainly hope that in the age of COVID, that investors will continue to prioritise issues around health, and there certainly can't be a better time in history to go tobacco free.
Thank you, Dr. King, and all of our presenters for describing the depth of this problem and some of the solutions. We now have a roadmap for taking action as investors and individuals. So I'd like to now turn to questions and answers, and maybe we can have all of the panelists turn their cameras on. And as moderator, I'll ask maybe 1 or 2 initial questions. So Dr. King, the way you've described it, tobacco-free finance seems to be somewhat of a no-brainer. So what are the biggest challenges you see in the US in preventing finance leaders from acting?
Well, actually, I think it's really around having the conversation. I think that today's session has been great, and I think that when people become more informed, it really does provide a lot of inspiration to take action. So I think it's really just been something that has probably, the finance sector has just always been tangled up in tobacco. It's a legacy issue. It's just been happening forever. And so I think that it's simply something that requires some time on the agenda, a little bit of learning. I think everybody knows that tobacco is bad. Everybody knows tobacco kills, but people are probably less aware of recent information about tobacco companies, their current behaviour, the way that what they do, perhaps in the USA, is quite different to what they do in many low and middle income countries around the world. And even things like the environmental impacts, I was unaware of those until a couple of years ago. I'd love to survey everyone online and ask them if they knew that cigarette filters were the #1 ocean plastic. I mean, I think that it's really important to become informed and to be able to make an informed decision. And we've got 150 of the world's biggest organizations have signed up to the pledge, the Tobacco-Free Finance Pledge. They control $11 trillion now. And it's a huge amount of money that has shifted, towards, a great initiative. And I have to say that finance leaders, by and large, just feel fantastic when they go tobacco free. They feel like they're really, making a great decision and that they're on the right side of history. So I simply think we all need to sit down and have a bit more of a chat.
Thanks. And I don't know if anybody wants to add anything. Just feel free. And then maybe I'll turn to David. Which fund managers have the smokiest funds and which ones have the least smoky funds?
Sure. So as one of the findings in our report, we also assembled around 1,000 funds across all these different managers and averaged them about their tobacco exposure. So it turns out that American funds, they're the manager with the smokiest funds on average. It's much higher than kind of like a benchmark fund of the total stock market index. In total, about 3% of all their holdings are invested in tobacco producers or promoters. There's also some managers with almost close to zero. So Mainstay was the only manager that we found that had 0% in tobacco exposure. So additionally, like Schwab and Vanguard, some of the larger fund managers are near the higher end of their tobacco exposure in comparison to benchmarks. So you can check out the report. You can see different performances by all these large fund managers.
Excellent, thank you. And Dr. Gardner, could you talk about we hear that there's a new law in California regarding flavored or menthol cigarettes, and then a petition and a campaign to overturn it. What is the role of tobacco companies in that effort, and do you think this is going to be successful?
So on August 28th, the state legislature passed, well, on August 28th, the governor signed into law SB 793, which would restrict the sale of all flavored tobacco products, including menthol cigarettes. It's following the lead of Massachusetts that became the first state to do that. That was on Friday, August 28th. By Monday, August 31st, the tobacco industry had filed for a referendum so that they could collect signatures to block the implementation of this. They have until, I believe, November 26th to get 600,000 signatures, 630,000 signatures. Already we filed claims. They are going around fraudulently saying that getting people to sign this petition, you're going to get rid of menthol cigarettes. They're saying the exact opposite of what the petition will do. And it's actually very misleading. Unfortunately, they may be able to collect the signatures. What we've done in California, we're pushing forward around the country. You have to continue to fight at the local level to enact strong tobacco control policies that include restrictions around flavored and menthol cigarettes and little cigars. The tobacco, you asked the question of what they've done. They have filed a lawsuit saying that this is essentially illegal what the governor signed and that the legislature passed. And they've also filed for a temporary injunction toward this. So they have three things going at once. They have the referendum collecting signatures, they have filed suit, and they have filed an injunction. they're throwing everything against the wall that they can to see what sticks. And continue to do, people that are listening, the local work that has been so productive. I guess just last night, Sunnyvale, another city in California, passed menthol restrictions and the like. So there you go.
Great. Another questioner asked Dr. King, how do you plan to use the information on the media companies in your advocacy? And that may be a question for Cathy as well.
I think it's simply important for people to be aware that these media companies are, accepting money from big tobacco. They're sponsoring big events, so it's really trying to, buy that social license to operate. And unfortunately, we're seeing many big events where big tobacco are now appearing alongside otherwise very reputable people, it's a big step back. It feels like it's the 1980s. It's a big step backwards because we're just seeing, we know that in the public health world, everything we try to do is denormalize tobacco. And it's a big effort to try to re-normalize tobacco. So we certainly need to do everything we can to encourage media companies to be tobacco free.
Yeah, and if I could add too, I think the report can serve to amplify and increase investors' voices, particularly if more investors engage and ask questions of the media companies. Unlike the tobacco companies, there's a pathway for media companies to become smoke-free, and we think the steps are very doable.
Can I make a remark?
Please do, yes.
We have actually a special anniversary right now. In 1970, as I noted, the Congress of the United States passed a law that ejected the tobacco from broadcast media. Their commercials were stopped, period. X, no more. And when they did that, the amount of smoking in the shows sponsored by tobacco companies dropped by 60%, which demonstrates the influence that the sponsor had on the producers, okay? We're now seeing that instead of the tobacco being between the shows, it's in the shows. And the same dynamics may apply, but we frankly don't care how the tobacco gets in there. It needs to be gotten out for the safety, not only of young people in Europe and North America, but for the future of other countries who are struggling against serious headwinds and have to face this onslaught from American-based media companies like Netflix or Amazon or whoever else is essentially engaged in toxic dumping, taking their product that has toxic tobacco promotion in it and dumping it into other countries that as yet have no defense. It's not right, it's not fair, and it exposes the shareholders of these media companies enormously because, you can imagine what happened to the tobacco companies having to pay out billions upon billions. The media companies, frankly, can't afford that. They cannot afford that risk, and yet they keep persisting and taking it on. It's a mystery why they do it. We can all come up with hypotheses about why it persists, but the fact is we need to publicize the risk and make sure that people understand what they're taking on. If they buy a media company stock, is it's like they have a toxic dump in their closet, which you don't see on the prospectus, but it's there, and people just have to be aware of that. We can help them solve it if they want,
So here's an interesting question. Does divesting strategy make sense, or is that likely to simply drive companies to privatize themselves, or maybe overseas companies would acquire them? Or does divestment make sense for investors?
I think we have to go back to the problem here, and that is that, let's take a very big picture view. this report shows that a huge number of Americans with pension plans are investing in companies that make products that kill more than 500,000 Americans every single year, and they have no idea. Most of them will have no idea that they have this link to tobacco companies. And this isn't just America, it's the whole world. So I'm a radiation oncologist by background, and I found out that my pension plan was investing in tobacco companies. Now, can you imagine that? I've watched hundreds, if not 1,000 people die as a result of tobacco, and then I find out that my own pension plan is investing in the companies that make the products that are killing them. And so this is being played out all over the world, and we just have to accept that most people are unaware of this situation. And I think it's just hats off to David and the team for producing such a great report showing how common this is. And I think, as I was explaining, it really is binary with tobacco. If you invest in a company, you own part of that company, and you want that company to grow and succeed and thrive and find new customers and sell more products and expand. And I think we just, have to sit there and ask ourselves, is that what we want of big tobacco? Is that what we want? It's certainly not what I want. We have to ask, would you invest in a company that makes products that you personally are trying to protect your own children from? I mean, that just makes no sense. So I think, at the very heart of it, this is the quintessential sustainability issue when it comes to finance. I think there are many very complex sustainability issues out there that are going to take a lot of work and a lot of resources and a lot of thinking, but this is actually the easy one. You're either in or you're out, and so it's been a really great case study to get the sustainability discussions flowing in big financial organisations, and we're certainly seeing a huge increase in appetite in discussion around this during COVID, because people have really people are really just thinking, we need to prioritise health, and it makes sense to have a portfolio that really reflects that wish.
Excellent. And I will take that as your last minute. We've got 4 more minutes, so let me just end with the rest of you. If you have 60 seconds worth of just the last point to make, we'd love to hear that. Thank you, Dr. King.
Thank you.
Jono.
Yeah. Oh, well, I've worked on this for a long time, so I could occupy the next 4 hours with tidbits and details about this, but I agree with Dr. King that we need to cut to the chase here. It's really simply a case that tobacco is a poisonous product made and sold for profit. If you go to a movie and the movie includes a villain who is the CEO of a worldwide conspiring corporation of evil, that is what the tobacco industry amounts to. And the fact that they can send their message through entertainment to kids and adults, to people of all ages all over the world, is about the biggest public health conspiracy I can think of. That's what attracted me to this issue in the first place. It seemed so obvious, so cut and dry, that people would be so instantly outraged that we'd be able to resolve this in 5 years. Now, obviously, it's taken longer than that, but I think if we put a price tag on it, of the media companies' access to the financial markets, if we have disincentives rather than incentives for them to be doing what they're doing, then I think we can change this and resolve it pretty quickly. And we thank everybody for your help.
And Cathy.
Yeah, given the tumultuous times that the entertainment media industry is in right now, and the shape that many of these companies are in right now, why take on a risk that's really avoidable? As I mentioned, in this age of COVID, in this age of calling out and crying out for social justice, there is a pathway out for the entertainment media companies, and I think this could be solved very easily and in a very short amount of time. All we need is the will and investors' voices.
Thank you. And Phillip, any parting words?
I would just remind folks, and not just my panelists, but everybody here, that the tobacco industry perpetuates the discriminatory practices that have plagued this country for years. The COVID-19 crisis has just peeled back the layers and shown the injustice. And I would suggest to you, if we really think that Black Lives Matter, which I think I do, then getting menthol cigarettes and flavored little cigars out of our community should be the first step. I want to say one last thing. I think it could be done easily too. I've been in the political fight for Black lives since the 1960s. This is a marathon, folks. Hopefully we can meet again next year and we've taken even larger steps. But be clear, this is a marathon, and I want to thank you guys for having me on.
Thank you. And David, we'll give you the last word.
Sure, I think getting tobacco out of retirement funds is an important step, but it's the first of many towards a comprehensive social responsibility. So I think the time is now for people to engage on all the issues they care about, from the environment to social justice, and really invest in the world that we want to create, invest in the world for our children and future generations. So I think As You Sow and the Invest Your Values is a great platform to get all these issues across tobacco and all the others we talked about today. So thank you everyone and panelists for joining us for this discussion.
Yes, thank you all. Next slide, please. So just wanted to let you know there's been a few questions. We will send the slides out, and we will also, I know there are a few questions that we didn't get to answer, and so we will answer those and send that around. And then I just wanted to point out a legal disclaimer. We are not asset managers and we are not giving investment advice today. And that's it. So thanks to all our panelists for your wisdom, and have a great day.
Thank you,
Thanks,
everyone.
Emma. Thank you.
Thank you.